So far we talked about embryology and fossils as evidence for evolution. In this video we're going to talk about how anatomy can be evidence for evolution. Make sure you're taking notes as you go through this video so that you can understand and remember how anatomy is evidence for evolution. Before we can talk about how anatomy relates to evolution, we have to talk about what anatomy is. We're going to do a whole unit on anatomy during fourth quarter, but for now, anatomy is just the study of the way bodies are put together. When we're talking about evolution, there are three important structures scientists are going to look at. They're going to look at homologous structures, analogous structures, and vestigial structures. We're going to go through each type and how each type supports evolution. First, looking at homologous structures. Keep in mind from previous units what homo means. Remember that homo means same. We talked about homologous chromosomes, homozygous. Homo always means same. So homologous structures are structures or parts of the body, like your hand, your foot, that may have different functions in different organisms, but have evolved from the same ancestor. Homologous structures, therefore, share the same common ancestor, but may have a different function, saying it in other words. For example, if you look at the hand of a human, the wing of a bat, flipper of a dolphin or whale, and you compare the bones inside those limbs, you see that they're actually homologous structures, or very similar. If we take a closer look and color code things a little bit, it's even clearer. So for instance, humans have this bone called the humerus. It's the upper bone in your upper arm. But if you took the arm of a cat, a whale, or even a bat, they all happen to have the same single bone running through their upper arm. Now, if you look at the forearm, or the bottom part of a human, there are two bones that make that up, something called the radius and the ulna. If we look at the ulna, you'll notice that, again, all four of these animals have their own ulna, or bone that runs in the bottom part of your arm and on the inside. Next to the ulna, in all four organisms, is something called the radius. And if you went down to the hand, you could see even more similarities. So essentially, when we're talking about homologous structures, we're talking about the fact that these four different species share the same structural traits of having these bones in their forearm, even if the shape and size of these bones are very different. Take a second and think. Why are the front limbs of humans, whales, cats, bats so different in appearance if they came from the same common ancestor? If it helps, start by answering these two questions. Why don't people have fins or wings, and why don't whales have legs? When you've finished answering this question in your notes, answer this second question. How is this idea of homologous traits linked to evolution? Again, make sure you write down both answers in your notes. Scientists think homologous structures give a lot of evidence for evolution. Homologous structures seem to support the idea that as organisms move to different environments, they experience different selective pressure. Think back to our study of evolution. What is a selective pressure? It's what causes organisms to evolve or change. It's what makes certain traits good. Well, if different environments have different selective pressures, this might cause a structure to start to look different than it did from its ancestors. Example, if the ancestors of whales and humans moved on land but also in the sea, the organisms that moved into the more aquatic or water-like lifestyle would want their front limbs to develop more into the flipper or the fin of a whale. On the other hand, humans were living on land where maybe they needed to use tools, and so they started to evolve to have something similar to our hands, with fingers and opposable thumbs. The next type of structure is called an analogous structure. Analogous structures have the same exact function in different animals or different organisms, but have evolved from a different ancestor. They are similar because of use, not relatedness. An example could be wings. There are lots of different organisms that have wings. There are insects, birds, bats. But if you break down or look closely at the wings, they're all very different. For instance, insects have wings similar to these of a dragonfly that appear to have no real bone structure. If you were to zoom in on the wing of a bird, they do have bones running throughout, but at the same time their bones are actually hollow to make them light to fly. And the most part of the wing is made up of feathers. This would be, again, very different if you looked at the wing of a bat. So analogous structures have the same function, but not because two species are related in any way. So think, how do analogous traits show how the environment a species lives in affects what it looks like? Write your answer to this in your notes. Also answer, if a trait is beneficial in water to one animal, is it likely good for another animal that lives in the same water? And answer the last part, how do analogous traits support survival of the fittest in evolution? Again, make sure you pause the video here so you can write out your answers to these questions. Don't just think of them in your head. To summarize all three questions, analogous structures support evolution because they show that two organisms that came from very different places or different ancestors, when placed under the same environmental pressures, evolve to have the same adaptations. Thinking in terms of survival of the fittest, this means that if you live in the water, you will evolve to have something like a fin, because that is the structure that makes you fittest in the water, makes you fastest, makes you best at swimming. Analogous structures support this idea. So just to summarize, homologous versus analogous structures. Homologous structures came from a common ancestor, which is important, and may or may not have the same function in different organisms. Whereas analogous structures definitely come from different ancestors, but because of a similar environment, they do have the same function.
The last type of structure we need to talk about is called the vestigial structure, or vestigial organ. These are organs, or they could just be a part of an organ, that are non-functional, meaning you can't use them anymore, you don't need to use them anymore, and oftentimes go away or degenerate. An organ generally loses its function because there's no selective pressure or advantage for having it, meaning you don't need to use it anymore. It doesn't serve you any real purpose. But at the same time, in order for there to be a vestigial organ, it also can't have any sort of selective pressure to get rid of it. So in humans, some examples are wisdom teeth and your appendix. Your appendix is a small part or a small organ, and your wisdom teeth are the teeth in the back of your jaw. Some people even get their wisdom teeth removed, so clearly they're not necessary, but when we used to eat more raw food, it was required that we had these wisdom teeth, or these teeth in the very back of our jaw, so we could have an easier time eating the food. In some cases, you also get your appendix removed if you get some sort of infection. So maybe eventually humans will have no appendix and wisdom teeth will stop growing in. In other animals, as we looked at yesterday with the fossil activity, there are small vestigial leg bones. So in whales, for instance, they obviously don't use these leg bones, but because their ancestors once walked on land, they still have them. And in snakes, this is the same. If you take a snake and you run your hands along the bottom of it, you'll actually be able to feel leg bones. For scientists, evolution is the best way to explain these vestigial organs. They ask themselves a lot of times, why would humans have something like a tailbone, known as your coccyx, if our ancestors never had tails, right? You wouldn't just grow this bone if there was no past ancestor with a tail. And so scientists say that it's the remains, or what's left from human ancestors once having a tail. As you can see, anatomy has a number of different ways that it supports evolution. All these ways are somewhat related, homologous, analogous, and vestigial organs, but it's important to know the difference. If you don't quite understand the difference between these three structures, or how each uniquely supports evolution, make sure you go back and watch parts of the video.